The screen flickers with black and white footage. Camouflage-clad Mohawk warriors standing firm behind barricades, rifles in hand. Police in riot gear stare them down from the other side. Helicopters buzz overhead. The tension is electric, even decades later. A voice cuts through the chaos with quiet urgency. In 1990, a conflict erupted over a patch of pine-covered land near Oka, Quebec. At first glance, it seemed like a local disagreement. A small town's plan to expand a golf course. But what followed was a 78-day armed standoff between Mohawk defenders and Canadian forces, and it would become one of the most significant Indigenous resistance movements in modern Canadian history. This wasn't just about a golf course. It was about sovereignty, colonialism, and a centuries-long fight over land and identity. The voices of the Mohawk people long ignored were suddenly heard across the nation and the world. The narrator pauses, then leans in. Was this just a land dispute? Or was it the eruption of something far deeper? Something buried in Canada's very foundation? The story of the Oka Crisis forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about history, justice, and whose voices are valued. This is a story the history books barely told you, but one we can no longer afford to ignore. Long before the standoff, long before news cameras arrived, the land at the heart of the Oka Crisis held deep meaning. It belonged to the Kanesatake Mohawk people, who had lived along the shores of the Lake of Two Mountains for generations. Their roots in this territory stretched back centuries, long before the borders of Quebec or Canada even existed. The Mohawk are part of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, a powerful alliance of Indigenous nations known for their sophisticated political systems and fierce defense of their lands. For the people of Kanesatake, the pine forest targeted for development was not just land, it was a burial ground, a sacred site, a place where ancestors rested and ceremonies had been held for generations. But like so many Indigenous communities, in Canada, Kanesatake had spent much of its history trying, and failing, to have its land rights recognized. Petitions for land claims had been ignored or delayed. Their legal ownership of the land was constantly disputed, even though their presence on it was undeniable. By the late 20th century, this failure of justice had created a powder keg. What happened in 1990 in Oka was not merely the rejection of a development project, it was the culmination of centuries of colonial disregard. The pine forest that was to be leveled wasn't just a scenic patch of trees, it was a living archive of Mohawk history, containing ancestral burial sites, sacred spaces, and cultural memory rooted in the land itself. Its destruction would have been more than physical. It would have symbolized yet another effort to erase Indigenous existence from the landscape of Canada. For the Mohawk people of Kanesatake, the proposed golf course expansion was emblematic of a much deeper and older injustice, the continued dispossession of Indigenous lands under the guise of progress. Despite having lived on and cared for that land since time immemorial, their rights had rarely been recognized by colonial governments. Their formal land claims had languished for decades, ignored or tied up in bureaucratic red tape, while developers moved freely and decisively. The town of Oka's approval of the expansion sent a clear message to the people of Kanesatake that economic interests still outweighed Indigenous sovereignty and cultural heritage. The expansion wasn't just a business decision, it was an act of dismissal. It reminded the Mohawk people that in the eyes of many, their voices, their traditions, and even the bones of their ancestors held less value than 18 holes of manicured turf. This long-standing pattern of marginalization and broken promises had reached a breaking point. The Mohawk weren't simply opposing a golf course, they were taking a stand against the systemic erasure of their identity, history, and rights. For them, resistance wasn't just justified, it was necessary for survival. By taking a stand in the forest that summer, they forced the nation to confront something it had long ignored: that reconciliation cannot happen without recognition, respect, and the return of what was unjustly taken. The pine forest became a battleground, not just for land, but for dignity, truth, and justice. In March 1990, faced with yet another disregard for their sacred lands, the Mohawk people of Kanesatake decided to act. Quiet meetings turned into bold resistance. Elders, women, and youth came together and erected a barricade at the edge of the pines, the forest that held their ancestors' remains and was slated for destruction, to make way for the golf course expansion. It wasn't just a symbolic gesture. It was a line in the sand. They weren't simply asking for respect anymore. They were demanding it. The barricade, made of felled trees, stacked tires, and later reinforced with vehicles and fortifications, stood as both a literal and figurative blockade, not only halting construction equipment, but forcing the wider world to stop and look at the underlying injustice. The Mohawk did not initiate violence. Their act was defensive, protective. They were standing on their own land, guarding the spirits of their ancestors, preserving what little was left of the physical link to their history. At first, the response was local. Town residents and officials expressed frustration, some questioning why the Indians were standing in the way of development. Others feared the protest would escalate, painting it as obstructionist and militant in the press. But to the Mohawk, it wasn't obstruction. It was protection. They were safeguarding a burial site that predated Canada itself, something they had tried to do for decades through formal channels without result. As tensions simmered, the local authorities made a fateful decision. Rather than seeking dialogue, they opted for force. In July 1990, the Quebec Provincial Police, the Sûreté du Québec, attempted to dismantle the barricade and remove the protesters. They arrived with tear gas, riot gear, and weapons. The Mohawk were armed as well, determined not to be bulldozed, literally or symbolically, once more. In the chaos that followed, an exchange of gunfire broke out. A police officer, Corporal Marcel Lemay, was fatally shot. It was a tragic escalation that shocked the country and solidified the standoff. What began as a peaceful protest to protect a sacred space had now become a national crisis. The Mohawk did not back down. In fact, the confrontation only reinforced their resolve and set the stage for one of the most intense and prolonged Indigenous land disputes in Canadian history. The standoff at Oka quickly spiraled into a full-blown national crisis after the fatal shooting of Corporal Marcel Lemay on July 11, 1990. The Quebec Provincial Police had raided the Mohawk barricades, attempting to remove protesters by force. In the confusion and tension of the raid, a shot rang out, killing Lemay and leaving the Mohawk community to face a wave of intense public scrutiny. The Canadian media, which had initially reported the protest as a local dispute, now shifted its focus to the standoff's violent turn. This single incident transformed a protest into an armed confrontation, fueling anger, fear, and mistrust on both sides. In the aftermath of the shooting, the Mohawk warriors, a term used for the armed men and women defending their territory, fortified the barricades with greater determination. They weren't just fighting for land. They were fighting for their dignity, their right to self-determination, and the preservation of their culture and history. More barricades were erected, blocking not only the road to the golf course but also key routes in and out of the community. The Mohawk weren't just defending their own land. They were making a statement to the world about the decades of injustice and neglect they had suffered at the hands of both the provincial and federal governments. Word of the situation spread rapidly, and reinforcements arrived from other Mohawk communities, including Kanawake and Akwesasne. These communities, bound by a shared culture and history, rallied to the defense of Kanesatake. The act of solidarity was not just about protecting land, it was about defending an entire way of life that had been systematically attacked by colonial forces for centuries. The presence of these reinforcements further entrenched the resolve of the Mohawk people. It wasn't simply a regional issue anymore. It had become a symbolic stand for Indigenous rights across Canada. The warriors were now fully entrenched behind their barricades, armed and prepared to face the overwhelming forces of the police and the military, if necessary. The standoff at Oka was no longer about just one piece of land. It was a flashpoint in the ongoing battle for Indigenous sovereignty and land rights. As the standoff continued, the government's dilemma deepened. On one hand, the blockade and armed resistance by the Mohawk had caused considerable disruption in Montreal, the economic heart of Quebec, which added pressure on the government to take swift action. The public was divided. Some supported the Mohawks' right to defend their land, understanding that the protest was rooted in centuries of colonial injustice. Others viewed the blockade as an inconvenience or even an act of terrorism, fueled by the inconvenience it caused in their daily lives. For many in Montreal, the disruption of their commute was a harsh reminder of how far the Mohawk were willing to go to make their voices heard, and it caused a deepening rift between the Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. But the Mohawk barricades were much more than a logistical inconvenience. They were an embodiment of resistance to systemic oppression. The Mercier Bridge blockade symbolized the power imbalance that had long existed in Canada between Indigenous peoples and the state. By cutting off this critical infrastructure, the Mohawk were sending a stark message. Their sovereignty and their rights could no longer be ignored. The disruption wasn't random. It was a direct consequence of decades of broken promises, unfulfilled treaty obligations, and the broader history of cultural erasure faced by Indigenous communities. The Mohawk knew that their resistance was not just a local issue. It was a confrontation with the broader colonial systems that had oppressed Indigenous peoples for centuries. The standoff was a reflection of centuries of unresolved land disputes, and it forced Canada to confront the legacy of these wrongs. The blockade wasn't just a political protest. It was a fight for recognition and respect, for the preservation of cultural and spiritual ties to the land that had been systematically disregarded. The Canadian government found itself facing a deep moral quandary. The Oka Crisis was a stark reminder that Indigenous issues were not just Aboriginal problems, but national ones. The government's decision on how to proceed would shape Canada's relationship with Indigenous communities for years to come. Would they use force to end the standoff, risking further violence and alienation? Or would they begin a process of true engagement, acknowledging the demands of the Mohawk and other Indigenous groups for self-determination and land rights? In a way, the crisis in Oka was not just about land or a golf course expansion. It was a direct confrontation with the historical and ongoing trauma faced by Indigenous peoples across Canada. It raised important questions about the limits of colonial power and the rights of Indigenous communities to protect their land, culture, and heritage. The Canadian government's response would not only determine the outcome of the standoff, but also have profound implications for the future of Indigenous rights in the country. Would the Oka Crisis become a turning point in Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples, or would it be another episode of suppression and disregard for Indigenous sovereignty? The decisions made in the coming days would echo through Canadian society for generations. As the standoff at Oka escalated, the Canadian government moved quickly to respond, deploying both the RCMP and the Canadian Armed Forces, CAF, to the scene. The RCMP had initially been called in to enforce the law and remove the Mohawk barricades. However, after the fatal shooting of Corporal Marcel Lemay by a Mohawk sniper, the situation became more volatile, and the Canadian government was forced to make more drastic decisions. The deployment of the Canadian Armed Forces marked a new phase in the crisis. The military was called in under the guise of restoring peace and maintaining public order, but their presence only heightened the tension. Armed soldiers, helicopters, and tanks became visible symbols of the state's power and its resolve to end the protest by force if necessary. The military's role added a layer of intimidation and violence that the Mohawk community could not ignore. For many in the community, this was yet another chapter in the history of colonial oppression, where the Canadian government used its military might to suppress Indigenous resistance. Public opinion across Canada was divided, and media coverage of the standoff played a critical role in shaping public perception. In the media, the protesters were often portrayed as violent militants, sometimes as terrorists or radicals, whose actions were framed as threats to public safety and order. The use of these charged terms was a powerful tactic to turn public sentiment against the Mohawk protesters, as the media coverage emphasized the inconvenience of the blockade and the tragedy of Corporal Lemay's death. This portrayal served to demonize the Mohawk as being irrational and extreme, obscuring the larger context of their resistance. Centuries of dispossession, cultural erasure, and broken promises from the Canadian government. On the other hand, the Indigenous perspective on the crisis was hardly covered with the same intensity. For the Mohawk, the standoff was about much more than a land dispute. It was about their right to protect their sacred burial grounds, their sovereignty, and their culture. The media coverage failed to adequately capture the deep-rooted frustration and trauma that had built up over generations. Indigenous voices were marginalized, and the urgency of their cause was lost in the sensationalism of the headlines. In reality, the government's response was slow and lacked meaningful engagement with the Mohawk community. While both sides had moments of negotiation, the dialogue was often strained and ineffective. The government, led by Prime Minister Brian Mulroney and Quebec Premier Robert Bourassa, offered little beyond empty promises. They spoke of peace talks, but the real issues, land rights, self-determination, and historical wrongs, were sidelined. Instead of meaningful dialogue, the government relied on military force and public relations tactics to manage the crisis, effectively reducing the conversation to one about law and order, rather than addressing the larger questions of justice and reconciliation. The lack of genuine dialogue led to a deepening mistrust between the Canadian government and Indigenous peoples, particularly the Mohawk. It was clear that the government's primary goal was to end the standoff as quickly as possible, even if it meant suppressing the Mohawk demands and continuing to sidestep the historical injustices that had led to the crisis in the first place. As the standoff dragged on, the government's strategy became clearer: containment rather than resolution. While negotiations continued behind the scenes, the military's presence acted as a deterrent and a reminder that the state was willing to use force to achieve its objectives. Yet, the deeper questions about land, sovereignty, and the treatment of Indigenous peoples went largely unaddressed, setting the stage for future conflicts. The Oka Crisis was a watershed moment for Canada, but its resolution was far from satisfactory for many Indigenous communities. The events of 1990 highlighted the deep, unresolved tensions between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian state, tensions that were rooted in centuries of colonial history and would not be easily swept away by military force or empty promises. The government response at Oka not only failed to address the core issues of land and self-determination, but also reinforced the very structures of oppression that had caused the crisis in the first place. The standoff at Oka ended on September 26, 1990, when the Mohawk warriors, who had been holding the barricades for nearly 3 months, finally agreed to dismantle them. The decision to end the blockade came after tense negotiations between the government and the Mohawk leadership, but it was not the result of any concrete resolution regarding the core issue: the land. The Mohawks had not received any guarantees that their ancestral lands, including the sacred pines, would be preserved or that their rights to the land would be recognized. Instead, the government's main concern was simply ending the standoff without further violence, and the negotiations centered more around saving face than addressing the root causes of the crisis. After the barricades were removed, several Mohawk activists were arrested, including key figures who had led the resistance. Many of these individuals faced charges ranging from mischief to firearms possession. While no one was charged with the death of Corporal Marcel Lemay, the legal repercussions for those involved in the protest were harsh and left lasting scars on the individuals and communities involved. These arrests became a symbolic gesture, further perpetuating the government's portrayal of the protesters as criminals rather than addressing the injustices that had brought them to the point of armed resistance. Despite the end of the standoff, the aftermath of Oka left deep, unresolved tensions. The Canadian government had promised to engage in dialogue with Indigenous communities to address land claims and the broader issues of Indigenous rights. However, little meaningful action was taken in the years immediately following the crisis. The Mohawk and other Indigenous communities were left feeling betrayed by the Canadian state as their concerns about land, sovereignty, and cultural preservation were once again ignored. The promises made by the government were vague and largely unfulfilled. The Oka Crisis was portrayed as a temporary disruption that would soon be forgotten, but for many Indigenous peoples, it became a defining moment of betrayal and resistance. The Oka Crisis also had profound long-term consequences. It galvanized Indigenous activism across Canada and served as a wake-up call for many Canadians about the persistence of colonial injustices. The crisis highlighted the growing divide between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government, and it exposed the failure of the state to address the real issues at the heart of Indigenous grievances. While the government's response to the crisis had been marked by heavy-handed law enforcement, it did not provide the kind of genuine engagement or reconciliation that Indigenous communities were demanding. The Oka Crisis served as a catalyst for future movements, including the Idle No More movement in the 2010s, which sought to address broader issues of Indigenous rights, environmental justice, and self-determination. The Oka Crisis left an indelible mark on Indigenous activism in Canada, significantly influencing the landscape of Indigenous resistance and shaping the future of land rights movements. The event served as a powerful reminder of the deep injustices Indigenous peoples face in their fight for land, sovereignty, and recognition. While the Oka Crisis itself ended in a tactical retreat, it was a defining moment that set the stage for an era of heightened Indigenous activism, as communities across Canada became more vocal and organized in their push for rights and justice. The impact on land rights movements was profound. Following the Oka standoff, Indigenous communities nationwide began to more openly assert their rights to land and self-determination. The crisis demonstrated that peaceful protest and legal challenges alone would not be sufficient in the face of a government that consistently failed to honor agreements, recognize rights, or address historical wrongs. It became clear that Indigenous peoples would need to be prepared to resist not only through diplomacy, but also through direct action if their voices were to be heard and their rights respected. The crisis also prompted a reassessment of government policies toward Indigenous peoples. In the years that followed, there were some efforts to improve the government's relationship with Indigenous communities, such as the establishment of the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples in 1991, which sought to examine the deep-rooted issues of systemic discrimination, land rights, and governance. While these initiatives represented some progress, they were seen by many as insufficient and too slow to address the urgency of the situation. The influence of the Oka Crisis can be seen in more recent Indigenous-led movements. The Wet'suwet'en protests in 2020, for example, echoed many of the themes and tactics of the Oka Crisis. The Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs led a fight against the construction of the Coastal GasLink pipeline through their unceded lands, which they argued violated their rights and sovereignty. The police involvement in the Wet'suwet'en protests, along with the disruption of infrastructure and the disruption of major trade routes, mirrored the actions taken at Oka, where blockades were set up to assert Indigenous rights. The Idle No More movement, which began in 2012, also owes much of its momentum to the legacy of the Oka Crisis. Idle No More grew out of the frustration with the Canadian government's ongoing disregard for Indigenous treaty rights, environmental degradation, and the broader marginalization of Indigenous peoples. The movement quickly spread across Canada, employing peaceful protest, social media campaigns, and blockades, similar to those seen at Oka, to bring attention to issues of environmental justice, Indigenous sovereignty, and government neglect. The Oka Crisis was not just a singular event. It became a symbol of the long-standing struggles of Indigenous peoples in Canada. The issues it highlighted, land rights, sovereignty, and the systemic marginalization of Indigenous communities, were not new, but the standoff brought them to the forefront of national consciousness in a way that had never happened before. It forced Canadians to confront the reality of colonialism's ongoing impact on Indigenous peoples, not as a historical relic, but as a living, breathing issue that shaped daily life and defined the future for many communities. The crisis made it clear that the promises made to Indigenous peoples through treaties and legal agreements were not being honored. The Canadian government, historically and repeatedly, had failed to uphold its obligations to the land rights and self-determination of Indigenous communities. The land at Oka, a sacred burial ground, was not just about territory. It was about a deep spiritual connection to the land that stretched back centuries. To the Mohawk people, it represented more than just real estate. It was an embodiment of their identity, culture, and history. The Canadian government's decision to push forward with the golf course expansion despite these concerns was seen as a continuation of the colonial mindset that Indigenous lands could be appropriated without regard for the people who had lived on and cared for them for millennia. Despite the violence and tension of the standoff, the aftermath led to significant shifts in how Indigenous resistance movements were viewed and how Indigenous rights were framed in Canada. The Oka Crisis sparked a wave of activism that inspired future generations of Indigenous leaders and activists to demand more. It demonstrated that direct action, such as the roadblocks, protests, and occupations, was a powerful tool for Indigenous peoples to claim back their agency. The message was clear. Indigenous communities were no longer willing to accept their erasure or invisibility in the face of settler colonialism. In the years following Oka, the momentum of Indigenous resistance did not fade. It evolved. The Wet'suwet'en protests in 2020, centered around the opposition to the Coastal GasLink pipeline, showed that the same struggles were still deeply relevant. Much like at Oka, the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs took a stand against government-imposed development on their traditional lands. This resistance paralleled the barricades and blockades set up by Mohawk communities, further connecting the two struggles across time and geography. The use of blockades and direct action in Wet'suwet'en, as well as other Indigenous-led protests like the Idle No More movement, reflects a continuity of Oka's legacy. These tactics have become important symbols of resistance in the fight for Indigenous rights. What has also changed since 1990 is the broader public awareness of these struggles. There is greater recognition now that the issues Indigenous peoples face are not just about land, but also about the ongoing impacts of colonialism on their ways of life, their families, their health, and their futures. The rise of social media and global communications has amplified Indigenous voices, allowing them to tell their stories in their own words and build solidarity networks far beyond their immediate communities. However, despite the increased awareness, these modern movements continue to face resistance from powerful political and economic interests. The Oka Crisis, with its focus on land rights and sovereignty, serves as a constant reminder that the promises made to Indigenous peoples are still unfulfilled. The broader systemic issues that caused the crisis, such as economic exploitation, political disenfranchisement, and the disregard for Indigenous governance, remain deeply entrenched in Canadian society. The Oka Crisis thus represents both a victory and a challenge. A victory in the sense that it brought about change and raised awareness, but also a challenge because it made it clear that there is much more to be done. The legacy of Oka is one of survival, resistance, and resilience, underscoring the fact that Indigenous peoples will continue to fight for their rights, and that the struggle for justice and recognition will persist until these issues are fully addressed. The continued fight for land rights, environmental justice, and Indigenous sovereignty is a testament to the enduring strength of Indigenous communities, and the Oka Crisis serves as a reminder that the path toward reconciliation is far from complete. The Oka Crisis was undoubtedly a turning point in Canadian history, but whether it marked a genuine shift in the nation's approach to Indigenous rights or was simply a warning ignored is still up for debate. While it sparked a national conversation about Indigenous sovereignty, land rights, and justice, the issues that led to the crisis, the dispossession of Indigenous land, systemic inequality, and the erosion of cultural identity, are far from resolved. The lessons of Oka should serve as a powerful reminder that when injustices go unaddressed, they don't disappear. They fester, and sometimes they explode. The Oka Crisis was a stark reminder that the struggle for Indigenous rights is ongoing, and that the fight for land, justice, and recognition is far from over. For those who seek to understand these issues more deeply, it is essential to continue learning, supporting Indigenous-led movements, and advocating for real change. Educating ourselves about the past and listening to the voices of Indigenous peoples is the first step toward meaningful reconciliation. So, what can you do? Learn more about Indigenous land rights, educate yourself on the history of colonialism, and support movements that fight for justice and sovereignty. Let's not let the lessons of the Oka Crisis be forgotten. What do you think? Was the Oka Crisis a turning point, or was it a warning ignored? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more hidden stories from history.